Welcome to the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee regular discussion evenings. Just allowing for the attendees to drop in, which I think they have slowed now. So, as I say, welcome to the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee webinar discussion on the very important subject of preparing for the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on older people. You're very welcome, and I'm sure we're going to have another excellent evening. I'm very grateful to the Physiological Society for their support in putting together this event. It is much appreciated on our part, and we have three very distinguished speakers to take us through that subject. Dr. Alison Giles, who is a Joint Associate Director for Healthy Ageing at the Centre for Ageing Better and Public Health England. Welcome. Dr. Claire Stevens, Clinical Senior Lecturer at King's College London. Welcome, Claire. And Professor Paul Greenhalgh, Professor of Metabolism, Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, University of Nottingham. But before I ask our three speakers to make their presentations, I would just like to invite Professor David Patterson, who is President-elect of the Physiological Society, just to say a few words about the Society's new report on the very same topic, a national COVID-19 resilience programme involving the health and well-being of older people during the pandemic. David, please give us your thoughts.
Stephen, I'd just like to thank you and your colleagues on the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee for hosting the launch of the Physiological Society report preparing for the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on older people. And from my perspective, this has been a very important piece of work that the Society has undertaken under the joint leadership of Professor Paul Greenhalgh from the University of Nottingham and Dr. Alison Giles from the Centre for Ageing Better, who you will both hear from shortly, alongside Dr. Claire Steeves, consultant gerontologist from King's College London. So why is this report particularly important for policymakers and parliamentarians like yourself? And simply put, age is the most powerful negative prognostic indicator for morbidity and mortality associated with COVID-19, especially when superimposed on underlying pathology. And you're going to hear shortly that it is not necessarily your chronological age, but indeed your physiological age that will determine how well you deal with this if you are unfortunate enough to pick up this virus, which is a multi-organ disease, and the consequences of it are dramatic, as we know in the national statistics, but also more importantly, in the age demographic, it has major knock-on consequences for a new syndrome that we call long COVID, which is very poorly understood. And I hope we'll hear more about this in the discussion that will follow. So it gives me really great pleasure to be able to formally launch this report from the Physiological Society, which hopefully many of you would have had the opportunity to see today and also see it in the national media. There was a good feature in the Times today on it. A national COVID-19 resilience program aimed at improving the health and well-being of older people during the pandemic. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed, and I'm sure we all look forward to having a close look at that report. We will now move on to our three speakers, each of whom I'm going to invite to speak to us for around 12 minutes. I'll try and keep you to time if that's okay, just so that we've got plenty of time for questions later. At about 6 o'clock, I've got to drop off for half an hour just to go and have a briefing with the Secretary of State for Health, when Stephen Benn will take over chairing the discussion, and then I will come back. Right, usual for attendees, usual rules apply. When you're not speaking, please stay muted. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the chat function or the Q&A. I will try and keep an eye on both, and then we will come to, and I'm sure Stephen will as well, when we come to questions, we'll try and pick out the ones that come through in the right order. So we will go to our first speaker, which is Dr. Alison Giles. Alison, please give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Stephen. I will share my slides. Can everybody see those?
We can now, yes.
Good, okay. So thank you for the invitation to speak. As has been flagged, I jointly chaired this initiative for the Physiological Society and Centre for Ageing Better with Paul Greenhoff, who we will be hearing from after me. So just to give you an idea of what we are going to be talking about. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about the Centre for Ageing Better for those of you who are not familiar with us. Talk about the rationale for why we've kicked off this joint project and indeed why we're launching the report today. Tell you a bit about what has happened to older adults during COVID-19 lockdown, so that period between particularly March and July. What support older adults would like to see as we enter winter and into this second lockdown, and just finally what our report is recommending. So about the Centre for Ageing Better, as all of you will be aware, we are all living longer than ever before, and in the next 20 or so years, a quarter of us will be aged 65 or over. So we're seeing a big shift in the demographic towards more older adults. And we believe that unless radical action is taken by government, by civic society and by others, there'll be millions of us at risk of missing out on a good later life and making the most of the extra years of life expectancy that we have. So our Centre for Ageing Better was set up by Lord Jeff Filkin, with funding from the Big Lottery Community Fund. And our purpose is to change policy and practice informed by evidence to make sure that everybody in England has the opportunity to live a good later life. And we focus on health, on housing, on communities, and on work, paid work. So that's a little bit about us. Why this report now? So we have seen a disproportionate impact of the COVID infection on older adults, but we were seeing that there are other risk factors as well as chronological age. So we wanted to tease out what was unique to older adults as opposed to what was related to other factors such as underlying morbidity. We also had a suspicion that shielding and lockdown more generally were having problems of their own, causing issues of their own, which we needed to tease out, particularly in light of the prevailing narrative, which has been very much that older adults are sort of passive, almost victims in this pandemic and need to be shut away and shielded, looked after, and had no sense of control over their destinies or any sense that there were things that they could do beyond the government guidelines as they stand to protect themselves and put themselves in as good a place as possible in the event that they got the infection. So we thought that we needed to put in place some public health recommendations that would really speak to promoting older adults' resilience to both catching the virus, to surviving it, and also recovering from it. So the key lines of inquiry were threefold. So what is happening to healthy older adults as a result of shielding and social distancing? So what's happening with them not leaving their homes as often and not interacting in the ways that they were used to before lockdown? What do we know about how the disease affects older adults? And lastly, what are the long-term impacts on older people who've recovered from COVID? So as part of this project, the Physiological Society commissioned a survey from YouGov, and they surveyed 2,226 adults who were aged 50 and over. And they asked a number of questions about people's experiences during lockdown and their behaviours, how things had changed since the 23rd of March. And what they found amongst the respondents was around a third of people were less physically active during lockdown than they had been before. They gave a mix of reasons, which were sort of included that they no longer felt they needed to leave the house. They were worried, they were fearful about catching the virus, but also they just sort of felt they lacked motivation to exercise. The normal avenues that they had been closed off potentially, like classes or swimming, and they didn't really have the motivation to do anything else. We found that about a third were doing more physical activity, which is great, and about a third were doing the same. But worryingly, that third who were doing less, we need to understand more about those and to support them to become active again. And 36% of the respondents had not picked up their physical activity levels after the lockdown finished to levels that they were being active at before lockdown. So we've seen a longer term impact of lockdown on older adults' physical activity levels. And we also heard a bit about mental health, which seemed to be the other key issue that has been exacerbated by lockdown, in particular by the pandemic. So prior to lockdown, 6% of respondents said that they had reported feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge every day. But that shot up to 16% of them during lockdown. And 13% reported feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge after lockdown had finished. So just in the last month or so, people were still feeling fearful, anxious about the future and about their situation. And we found that for the very oldest respondents, so people who were 75 and over, 3% felt anxious, nervous before lockdown, but that rose to 11% during lockdown and has only dropped to 9% after lockdown. So mental health has really suffered as a result of the pandemic and as a result of us encouraging people to stay in and reducing their social interaction and feelings of control. And we asked what older adults would like in terms of support, and these questions were asked before the second lockdown was announced, and here we are now. So, very much of the moment we need to be thinking about how we respond to the responses that people gave us. So people are interested and would like tailored advice on physical activity, particularly those who have underlying health conditions. So they feel that they would like a bit more information about what is safe for them to do and how they can do physical activity, how they can be more active, whilst also trying to protect themselves from the virus. People were very interested in a multitude of different channels for delivering that advice. So we saw a clear sort of divide between the younger end of respondents, so people in their 50s and 60s who were quite happy to have digital support and advice, whereas older cohorts were really interested in advice that was support offered through televised channels. And people were, the second greatest worry and area that people wanted support with was around getting food. So people wanted more online supermarket delivery slots that were dedicated to older shoppers, but also better availability of those protected slots that we saw in supermarkets. So people being able to go and do their shop at a safe hour of the day when they weren't going to be mixing with so many other people. So in terms of our recommendations on the back of the survey findings and on the back of the physiological changes that Paul is going to outline and some of the other impacts of COVID that Claire will cover, we've come up with this idea of an overarching national resilience programme. And the idea around it is to build on the big initiative that we saw at the start of the pandemic, where we were focused on identifying those at risk and inviting them to shield and giving them lots of advice on how to shield and making sure people could access the services that they need. We now want to really promote something a little bit more holistic and a bit more empowering for older adults that recognises that people will want to shield, but really gives them the support and the tools that they need to maximise their health and well-being whilst they're protecting themselves. So a bit more positive, a bit more empowering, a bit more support for people. So the resilience programme would cover 4 areas or three key areas. Encouragement to exercise, so tailored support for people who have underlying health conditions which put them at greater risk if they were to contract the virus, so obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and also broader guidance on how they can be active and, if not meet the CMO's guidelines, at least move as often as they can in creative ways. And encouragement to consume a healthy diet. And as Paul will outline, older adults need a certain amount of protein, they need all of the nutrients. And we want really to make sure that the dietary advice that people receive is very clear of how that will be protective if people were to contract COVID and how it can support their immune system. So as well as offering the advice, we want to really make sure people understand that it has a protective effect. And lastly, to support and enhance mental health and well-being. So we would like to encourage organisations to reach out and create communities and opportunities for older adults to stay connected with each other, be that virtual or in person as and when situation allows, but also to explore the idea of super bubbles, so allowing older adults more contact across more households, so 4 individuals from 2 different households, just to really boost their mental health and well-being and not allow people to slide into sort of feelings of despondency and pointlessness. And to support all of those 3 areas, we really want to see we want to get the messages out to those people who are helping and supporting older adults to really make sure they promote these messages too. So to keep reminding their loved ones that physical activity is so important at the moment and as we enter winter. So to make sure that we're really encouraging that kind of behaviour change and not just encouraging people to stay sedentary, but keep people moving. And as we saw with shielding, to encourage the health service to really identify who is at risk because of underlying health conditions or just age alone, and to try and provide that proactive contact and case finding and support to those individuals, make sure the communications are out there, because we've got lots of different ideas and things that can be done, lots of initiatives already being run, but it's about communicating those now and making sure people hear the messages and making use of all those wonderful NHS volunteer responders and the social prescribers that we have now in place to help spread that message. So those are the report recommendations. And this is the government communications tool as it stands at the moment, launched on the 9th of September. So it's about washing your hands, wearing a mask, and making sure there's space between you and other people. And why don't we try and call for a 4th arm to that, which is about keeping active. If we can persuade Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and others, whenever they're giving public-facing briefings, to keep that message about keeping active, I think that would go a long way to supporting people to feel that they have some control over their situation as we enter winter. So thanks, Stephen. I will leave it there.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. Excellent presentation and setting the scene for us very well. As someone who has been, falls into that extremely or clinically extremely vulnerable group, there is, I think, quite a lot of interest in this, especially for those who feel and are perfectly healthy, other than potentially have an underlying condition that doesn't trouble them, but they would like to know a great deal more about where the risks and benefits lie. So, I mean, some of the work that you're proposing to do, I think will be very helpful to a wide range of people. So thank you very much indeed for that. Right, we will move on to our next speaker, who I think I mispronounced when I welcomed Claire, because it's Dr. Claire Steeves, and I think I said Stevens, and I shouldn't have done. So I apologise for that. But Claire, please give us your thoughts.
So, Stephen, I'm very happy to speak next, but was Professor Greener going to speak next?
Will.
I'm willing to do whichever you wish. I'm sure.
Well, that's the order on my list, but I'm flexible. So let's go to Paul. Perfect. That's it.
Yeah, apologies.
Brilliant. Thank you. No problem.
So here we see change in muscle mass with age, and you'll see there's a decline from about the age of 30 onwards. From 40, it's at about 2% per annum. And in the red area, you see this term sarcopenia, and this is where muscle mass is 2 standard deviations greater than the young value. It has a prevalence in the 60 to 70-year-olds of about 15%, and as we reach 80 and onwards, it increases to 50%. So it's the loss of muscle mass associated with aging. Why is this important? Because we know from many years of research that muscle mass is important to function. And here you see a classic paper from Frontier and Meredith, which basically shows you maximal voluntary contraction. So this is maximal force in a young person at 100% and maximal voluntary force in an older person. And as you can see, it's about 60% of the young person in the older person. And in the box here, you see the strength needed to get out of a chair. So there are some older people who are using, their full strength to get out of a chair, and some who cannot get out of a chair because they're not strong enough. And I'll come back to why that's important as we move on. Another feature of age is increasing adiposity. So you see here age in decades along the x-axis and mass on the y-axis. It's not just body fat mass that increases, but it's also visceral fat and intramuscular fat, which increases. And here you see in males and females, the increase in visceral fat or abdominal fat with age. And here you see in dots, these are lipid droplets in muscle of older people. So you can see the muscle starts filling up with lipid. And both visceral fat accumulation and muscle intramuscular lipid accumulation are very much related to poor quality of life, so cardiometabolic health risk. The other factor of aging is deconditioning. So each dot is an individual, and you can see with age, there's a clear decline in what's called maximal oxygen uptake, which is basically a gold standard measure of cardiac function and mitochondrial ability to extract oxygen. So this is an age-related phenomenon. What happens when elderly people become inactive? So here you see a paper from Lee Breen and Stu Phillips in 2013. Each of these are individuals. So when they went from a step count, normal step count of between 1,200 and say 4,000 steps per day to around about 1,300 steps per day. So this is equivalent to lockdown. You see on the right-hand side, the ability of muscle to synthesize protein when fed. So when they're in the fasted state, muscle protein synthesis is low, and it doesn't matter what the step count is. But the ability of muscle to build protein is clearly impaired as a result of step count reduction. And this is called anabolic resistance to protein nutrition. And this is a major feature of inactivity. And obviously, if you have an older person with a small muscle mass and their inability, they become unable to synthesize protein due to lockdown, it's going to be a problem. Here you see a study out of Copenhagen. This is going from 10,000 steps per day to 1,300 steps per day for 2 weeks. So typical lockdown decrease in activity. Here you see the rate of glucose disappearance as a result of the step count reduction. So these individuals become more insulin resistant. They are unable to clear glucose from their bloodstream, which is a very strong predictor of poor metabolic health. Their maximal oxygen uptake, I showed the slide earlier showing maximal oxygen uptake declines with age. Within 2 weeks of lockdown, maximal oxygen uptake significantly declined, as had power output of muscle or muscle function, as had the mass of the muscles in the legs. So that's within 2 weeks, clear negative effects. So I basically have a schematic here to explain where I think the risks are. So we have a person getting older, they are sarcopenic, they have increased visceral fat, increased muscle fat, and they're deconditioned because physical activity levels are relatively low compared to a young person. In lockdown, there will be a rapid decline within 2 weeks. Clear physiological responses are occurring. If we have lockdown plus infection, there will be another major insult which will drive these processes further. So it becomes imperative that we are able to intervene during lockdown to maintain metabolic and physiological resilience in these people. If you don't intervene, then they will move to a new level in these, they basically age faster and become more susceptible to poor health and increased mortality. And then we have the question of recovery post-lockdown plus COVID infection, which is a fascinating area and is a bit of a black box at the moment. Just graphically to show off, pictorially to show you why this is important. Here you see a mid-thigh MRI image from a young person, 24-year-old, body mass 76 kilos, fat mass 10 kilos, fat-free mass 57 kilos. Here you see a 66-year-old male, body mass 81 kilos, who does 3,000 steps per day, fat mass 13 kilos. Here you see an elderly person, exactly the same, or just about the same weight, but with a much lower fat-free mass, much lower fat mass, who's doing 12,000 steps per day. And I think if you just compare these two images, you can see the fat mass is greater in the inactive person, and you can see that their muscle mass is lower. This is not just a factor of physical activity per se, it's probably also related to caloric intake during a period of decreased activity. What happens if you introduce rather than just trying to maintain step count, if you introduce a physical training intervention? So this is a classic study out of Frontera's lab and Bill Evans, where they trained elderly people, 8 repetitions, 3 sets per day for 3 days per week. So it's not a huge amount of exercise. It is resistance exercise. And here you see the weeks on the x-axis. This is male volunteers, but similar studies have been done in females. This is knee extension, this is knee flexion, just different leg activities. But you can see there's a clear increase in strength over time with this supervised training program. There's also clear increases in muscle cross-sectional area of both legs during this period. So you could advise people to maintain their step count. This will help maintain metabolic resilience, but we could also try to look towards more supervised training programs if possible. Obviously, this won't be possible in frail individuals. So finally, I'd just like to flag the report. We know, in the time period we have, it's impossible to cover everything. We have a number of recommendations from the report. Here are the headlines. So encouragement to exercise, and certainly not to decrease physical activity levels. And we have to get a lot more streetwise about the best ways to do this. Encourage to consume a healthy diet. And by that, I also mean maintain energy balance, as well as composition of the diet. Support to enhance mental health and well-being, and support confidence building and behavior change, as Alison said. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul, for that. I must say that when I listen to you talking about the factors involved, normally I would incur a great deal of physical activity to get to the house where the meeting is being held. And the amount of activity I've needed to get to the room I'm talking to you from is, zilch. So yeah. You've made the point very effectively, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. Can we now move on, please, to the third of our speakers, Dr. Claire Steeves, who is the Clinical Senior Lecturer at King's College London. Thank you very much for joining us, Claire, and over to you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Stephen. And I hope you can see my slides. Can you see them now? Brilliant. So I'm going to explore the relationship between COVID-19 and aging. In particular, we're thinking about maybe some of the long-term implications. And I work as a consultant geriatrician at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, just opposite Houses of Parliament. And I'm also a clinical senior lecturer working on aging. But for the last 8 months or so, I've been working heavily on COVID. I'm research lead for the COVID symptom study app, which you may have seen. You can see our logo up there. And having devised the app, or the clinical details of the app, right back in March. And obviously we've been informing government on many things, including some things related to aging. And so I'll be telling you some of those things in this presentation, and also happy obviously to answer questions. So acute COVID, well, we've already heard, haven't we, how acute COVID has a very disproportionate impact upon older adults. Both there's this huge escalation in risk of hospitalization, but also in mortality. And we saw that right from the beginning in Wuhan, people who are over 80 having a very high excess mortality compared to other younger people. And we've seen that in the UK as well. So 89% of the deaths in England and Wales from the first wave were from over 65-year-olds. And you can see down at the bottom there, a little graph from some of the data from the COVID symptom study app, looking at the odds ratio of somebody being admitted to hospital if they were in different age categories compared to the 20-year age bracket. And you can see that older adults over 70 have a sort of 7 or 8 times increased risk of being admitted to hospital if they have a positive test for COVID. That's from the COVID symptom study app data. Now, the question, I guess, is why is this? And Paul has showed you a little bit about what happens to muscle physiology with aging. But actually that sort of physiological change happens across the organ systems, and particularly of relevance to COVID is the respiratory function, which is partly muscle actually within your rib cage, muscle function, but also your lung function in itself changes with age. Your kidney function changes, so your ability to cope with fluid changes. But most importantly, it's your immune system that changes when you age, which means that actually older people are much more at risk of almost every infection that you can conceive of, but particularly respiratory viruses. And that's why we see an increased risk in, for example, flu. And it's of no surprise, therefore, that that's been a key thing to find within COVID-19. But when you put all of those things together, what you find is that actually 3 things together converge. One is the level of frailty of an individual. So some individuals, if you look at this scale down here, this is the clinical frailty scale developed by Kenneth Rockwood, which sort of categorizes people in terms of their overall fitness and their dependency on others, and their slowness of moving and their slowness of cognition. So if you are very fit or well, actually, and you're admitted to hospital with COVID, recent data shows that you actually have a better chance of a good outcome than a young person. And so this kind of reiterates the fact that actually, if we can improve and maintain the resilience of the fit older adults amongst us, then this will mean that there will be less detrimental effect on those individuals if they catch COVID. So obviously frailty is a major factor. That's what we've is seen very clearly from the data, that if you're in the mildly frail to the very frail group, so showing evident slowing of walking and physical fitness, you're much more likely to have worse outcomes from COVID, including mortality. But comorbidities are clearly there. So these are diseases that also occur with aging. And age is an independent factor in its own right. Of course, many people who live in care homes are actually frail, and that's one of the reasons why we found in the first wave that there are really large numbers of people in care homes who died from the illness. But obviously we need to think carefully about what we could have done about that to prevent it for the next wave. 50% of deaths of people in the UK were from care homes in the early part of the first wave. So how do we deal with this wave? Well, definitely isolation and shielding did work to protect older people. And ONS clearly show this because they showed that in about August time, the immunity rate within the whole UK population was about 6% from SARS-CoV-2. But in older people, it was down at just under 4%. So older people were definitely shielding and therefore less getting the virus. But shielding has major side effects, and we've talked about a few of them. But one of the really key ones in the first wave was the problems in treating non-COVID conditions. And this was partly because older people were not wanting to burden the NHS. It's also partly because people were fearful of burdening the NHS. And also hospitals changed the access to care for older people, and older people disproportionately get all medical illnesses, and so that had a significant impact. And I think it's really important as we go into this next wave that all of the services that are there for cancer and for other diagnoses are still there for older people to have access to, so that we don't have this great spillover effect on other conditions. Reduced physical activity and nutrition was a major effect of lockdown. And Alison presented to you some really convincing data from the YouGov poll, which of course is a nationally representative poll. In the COVID symptom study app, we've also done the same thing. And we've asked 140,000 people have given us reports at 2 time points on how their physical activity changed before and after lockdown. And we see that people that are doing, people that are doing the correct amount of exercise, sort of, the CMO recommendations, the number of people that dropped, these are older adults that dropped in terms of they were meeting that, was significant after lockdown. And the numbers of people that were already exercising really less than once a week increased after lockdown. So we clearly saw a change in the physical activity levels of the whole population within the COVID symptom study app. Although, as Alison said, some people did improve their physical activity. And so therefore there is a clear way that we could improve that for everybody. I think, fear, mental health, quality of life are things Alison also brought out. And I would make a particular point about the care home problem that we had, because what we did with care homes in the first wave is we said that people cannot go and visit. What we've learned from the first wave is that PPE, adequate access to protective equipment for staff and also for family members who could be considered to be care workers for those people, does work in protecting people from getting COVID. Give an example. I work in a care home in Southeast London. We had a pretty big outbreak of COVID right at the beginning of March, which was part of what could inform me about the clinical characteristics to put on the app. But everybody that was in that care home that was negative when we tested everybody stayed negative throughout the rest of the pandemic. And there were no new staff members after that first initial insult that got COVID. And that's because we were able to use good PPE, which we should be using in all care homes going forward. And then people will have more confidence that they can still see their older relatives, perhaps. Obviously, vaccines will be key. And we've heard today, haven't we, how older people will be prioritised for vaccines. But of course, vaccines are usually less effective, slightly less effective in older people. And so we can't rely on the vaccines being our saviour, saving sort of stallion coming out to save the day, because we do need to be considering other options. And of course, physical activity and enhancing fitness does tend to improve immunity and may even improve response to vaccines, hence the need to really consider the report that we've put forward to you today. So a little bit about long-term impacts. Long COVID is more common in older people. This is something that we brought out in our data from the COVID symptom study app, where we looked at we defined long COVID as a persistent set of symptoms lasting for more than 28 days. Now, there will be other definitions of long COVID coming out, but from a data point of view, that's how we defined it. And we could see very clearly that the risk, here's a graph down here, the risk, again, the odds ratio of having long COVID increased with age, peaking in women over the age of 50, but increasing, especially in men, throughout the decades. And so this is important because, of course, in the media and so on, perhaps it's been more apparent that younger people get long COVID. That's actually not, it's disproportionately affecting older people. A new study about to be published, you will see, shows that actually older people who are admitted to hospital who have COVID are have an increased dependency, even if they survive hospital. So they're more likely to go into care or to need increased care at home. There may be other long-term sequelae of COVID. As you know, it affects the lungs and it causes some long-term damage and scarring to the lungs in some papers, in significant numbers of people, and also changes to the heart, potentially changes to the brain. We have yet to see. But all of these things, just like any acute illness, will exacerbate aging, will exacerbate those curves that we've seen Paul present. Management of non-COVID conditions also will have long-term knock-on effects, particularly in if cancer treatments are delayed or other long-term conditions are not managed as effectively. And of course, there will be long-term sequelae of a national inactivity, a national reduction in nutrition, increased BMI, and a national reduction in sense of purpose, which of course older people potentially have had if they've not been able to interact with their families in the normal way. So the full impact of COVID will depend on the resilience that we build now. So clearly that's one of the reasons why the report has been put together. And just going to go through and reiterate some of the messages from that. The key recommendations are that we really need to really encourage exercise, especially in the older adult group, give tailored exercise programs for at-risk groups in particular, to tell them what is safe for them to do. And there is existing data, examples of this already available, which we can make use of, and including broader guidance. For example, the Make Movement Your Mission, which is from Glasgow Caledonian University. Secondly, encouragement to consume a healthy diet, giving advice on nutrition and its role in building resilience to COVID-19. Finally, supporting mental health and well-being, really important across the community, but also in care homes, widening virtual communities and thinking about these super bubbles so older people are not just confined to their own homes. Support and confidence building. I mean, one of the things in the beginning of the wave was this great upswelling of volunteering and people willing to do things for their local community and try and support that. We need to build on that energy, enlisting relatives, care workers, other professionals, but also those social social prescribing link workers and NHS volunteers to really help build confidence and behaviour change within older people, and roll out anticipatory care models, identifying people that are most at risk of inactivity and most at risk of COVID itself, offering proactive advice and support. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire, for that. Now we are going to move on to a series of questions, and we've got a couple who've already indicated they want to ask questions. Can I put one first to you, Claire, as you mentioned it, and you quite rightly pointed out today's news about the vaccine development. Could you just remind everybody why it is thought that vaccines of whatever kind are less effective in older people?
Yeah, well, we see actually that in the flu vaccines, not every older person responds to the flu vaccine, and the rates of response are slightly lesser than they are in the younger population. But of course, the risk of flu and the risk of coronavirus is well in excess of that difference in response rate. So it's definitely the right idea to be targeting the vaccine towards older people, because if you do gain immunity, the gains that you have in terms of mortality and outcomes are so much greater. But I think that we mustn't think that it's going to be a magic bullet. There will be many older people who don't mount a response, given the fact that we need to vaccinate the entire nation of older people.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, now, as we move into the questions now, can I ask you, each of you, when you put your question, to say where you're from? And can I invite Trevor Crichton to put a question first? Trevor. You unmute yourself.
Hello, right. I'm from the Institute of Materials Finishing, which is nothing to do with COVID, but I'm just interested in this. When you're talking about exercise, how about isometric exercise? How does that compare with CV based exercise regimes?
Who would like to take that first? Paul?
Maybe I can answer that. Isometric exercise tends to cause fatigue pretty quickly. So that compared to dynamic contractions. Also, it would be hard to recruit a large muscle mass doing isometric contractions. So my suggestion would be to go for exercise where you're doing dynamic contractions, blood flow is increasing, and you can recruit a large muscle mass in terms of trying to push resilience or slow down deconditioning as much as possible.
All right, thank you very much. Tom Addison, would you like to put your question?
Actually, I don't think Tom's here, Stephen.
In which case, Tom has...
Oh no, apologies, here he is.
Is he there?
Hello, thank you, Stephen. Tom Addison from the Physiological Society. We didn't, as a kind of result of the chronology of the report coming out, talk about the vaccine announcement today. But I wonder, Paul, if you could talk a little bit about, or Claire, talk a little bit about how exercise and nutrition can improve the immunological response in older people to the vaccine.
Well, Claire, you're nodding most obviously, so perhaps you'd like to take that question.
Well, certainly I can tell you some very interesting studies that have been done from King's College London, where we looked at the immunity of a set of master cyclists. So these are people that are really very physically active, but were older. And you saw that the immune system really acted in those individuals very similar to very young people. Many of the changes in the immune system that seem to occur with aging are probably partly as a result of physical inactivity. There are other studies as well that show that physical activity interventions do have some impact upon the immune system. And so it's certainly true that maintaining your physical activity is good for your overall health. And it may well be true that maintaining and increasing your physical activity is going to help in your response to vaccine and your response to coronavirus.
Thank you very much. Can we move on now to Cherry Tweed? If you could put your question, Cherry, and tell us where you're from.
Hello, I work for an organisation called Radioactive Waste Management, so nothing at all to do with the subject, except that we're all getting older. My question was a specific one, actually relating to my parents. They've just completed 2 weeks of self-isolation after a possible COVID contact. They're both in their 90s. They do live unaided, but actually the biggest issue that they found with the self-isolation was that they couldn't leave the house for any reason. And they found that that 2 weeks of enforced inactivity has actually been a real problem to them, and they could feel themselves getting noticeably stiffer. And it did make me wonder, I can understand that they shouldn't come into contact with people, but their usual exercise would be a walk around the block in the early morning. And I wondered whether in fact the advice was right to keep elderly people completely incarcerated, compared with asking them to take some exercise, but actually not come into contact with people.
Well, now, who would like to take that first? I'm looking at all three of them to see what's more enthusiastic.
I'm quite happy to. I mean, I can only speak in my capacity as a citizen, and it has really puzzled me, that rule that if you've got to self-isolate because you may have come into contact, that you cannot leave the house at all. Whether for simplicity it was deemed to be the best advice in that you don't have to start nuancing quite what you can do and can't do. But I think it is something that we should probably, through this report's dissemination, raise with government officials, with the chief medical officer, in terms of the importance of physical activity. And I think, as we've highlighted, the rapid decline that you see if people are inactive, for that 2 week period could be the difference between getting out of a chair and not for some people. So I think it would be good to review that guidance and to keep emphasising the need to stay active. And again, also just thinking about how people can be creative about being active indoors. But no, I think it's a really good question.
Yes, Claire.
So just to second Alison's point about that, I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, to sort of say, oh yes, you can go out under certain conditions and so on. That's probably why that's not been the advice. But this comes to another bit of our report that obviously is that allowing older people to have specifically tailored exercise programs online and also on television would be really helpful, wouldn't it, in people that are meant to isolate, giving them really easy access to resources that will help them to keep their bodies moving if they are confined at home.
Thank you very much. One of the purposes of holding these meetings is that we can then send a report of the meeting with any recommendations straight away via our chair, Stephen Metcalfe, to the relevant minister. And I think this point about, as it were, taking a walk around the block for people who've been told to self-isolate is really very important, because I'm very struck by the evidence that you've all given tonight about how quickly things can deteriorate if you don't get out and about. In fact, it won't be long before I recommend that before any of our meetings starts, we have a little exercise regime for all the people who are looking online. Maybe that would be a good idea. Now, our next question is from John Lowe. So John Lowe, if you can hear me, please put your question and tell us where you're from. And off you go, John.
Right, I'm from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and we, of course, are an international body. And what I've heard today sounds excellent. I'm very happy with the presentations and the answers and questions and so on. But I'm puzzled if we are sharing the data that you presented internationally. Are we looking at information from other countries, and are we sharing our information with other countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Well, who would like to take that first?
Yeah,
All right, Paul first and Claire, because you nod so vigorously, it makes me think that you have something you want to add. So we'll do everybody, but Paul first then.
So in terms of a knowledge base, then, you know, that there have been several publications that are certainly pan-European that have appeared regarding exercise strategies in lockdown. So I do think that is, you know, information is being shared across Europe, definitely.
Okay. So there are in effect similar studies of the kinds that you've been involved in that you know of taking place in other European countries.
Yeah. Italy. Italy was actually amongst the first to respond to physical inactivity in lockdown, because obviously Italy experienced a pretty bad COVID situation early on. It's very interesting. So you have, you know, you also see in Denmark where, you know, the incidence of infections are very low, and certainly colleagues there have been very pro being remaining physically active to the Danish population.
Okay, well, physical exercise matters across boundaries, that is for sure. Claire, would you like to add something?
Yes, just to say that some of the data that I presented about, for example, frailty and hospitalization and so on, it has been from studies which have been done in 55 different hospitals across 12 countries across Europe. This is the COVID symptom study data. I'm pleased to say that we have 3 countries that are involved in it, one US, the other UK, and the other Sweden. UK is by far the largest, but our data that I showed you on changes in physical activity are replicated in the American group. And thirdly, so, you know, all our papers and all our research, I mean, one of the great things that's come out of the pandemic actually is the active sharing of research, even in preprint and so on, across the globe, so that every country can gain from these insights.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. Alison.
I don't really have anything to add, I'm afraid, to that question.
All right. Well, now we are due to have a few more minutes. And of course, I can't see everybody as I look at you all, but if anyone's got a further question, would you like to indicate now? I should have one of these marvelous screens that includes dozens of people, but at the moment, we don't.
Carol Monaghan has signalled she'd like to ask a question.
Well, Carol, I can't see you. Delighted you're here. Please put your question.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and Alison, thanks for spotting me. I wasn't quite sure how I could get his attention. Can I thank all 3 presenters? It's been really fascinating to listen to this evening. And I've got to say, during, I think it was Paul's talk, I had a check of my current steps, my average steps. And although one of the things I've started doing over the last 6 months is going for runs, which is the first time I've done that in 30 years. My average steps are still quite low. So I think that's something I have to work on. Anyway, I've got 2 questions, if you don't mind, Stephen. The first question is, it's about this activity for older people, first of all. I remember seeing a fabulous series on TV a couple of years back. I think it was a Channel 4 series, and it was called The Old People's Home for 4-year-olds. And it was where a nursery children and a care home were sort of put together, and they just kind of watched what happened. And you saw people throwing Zimmers away and doing things that they hadn't done in 10 years. Firstly, do we let our older population get away with sitting about rather than getting up and getting active? And secondly, Alison, a particular question for you. You talked about the mental health aspect for older people. Now, my parents are both in their 80s and they're fit 80s. But I've got to say, they've actually quite enjoyed having a lot of the nonsense removed from their life during first of all, the lockdown and then the restrictions, because before that, they were dashing about, picking up kids from school, doing this, doing that, not actually getting time to do what they want to do. But now I've seen them actually going out for walks, relaxing a bit more, just enjoying life a bit more. And I was surprised at the decrease in mental health. Is a particular group of older people that are struggling with that. I thought that was more an issue for younger people.
Alison.
Claire might be able to help as well on this. I don't know, in all honesty, Carol, if it's unique. I don't think it's unique to older adults. I think younger adults, sort of people in their 20s, have really struggled, but for different reasons, mostly around sort of, how it has affected their employment and their social lives and things. I think for older adults, it will have been a real mixed bag. So a bit like the physical activity results, I think you'll have seen that some people have thrived on there being fewer people outside, fewer cars. The environment may have got a lot nicer. People have probably been more supportive of older adults and giving people more attention. Whether that dropped off as lockdown finished and people went back to their busy lives, perhaps, all of the support that older adults have been getting perhaps tailed off. But I think for many older adults, it has been a period of great anxiety and uncertainty about when they will see their family, when they can get back to being connected through the types of clubs and activities they used to do. Many probably volunteered before, and then as a result of shielding or the closure of opportunities like National Trust and things, couldn't do the things that they did before COVID. So I think it is a real mixed picture. And so this report is about sort of highlighting that for some this would have been a really difficult period, and that sense of anxiety and fear is continuing.
Thank you very much. Claire, do you want to add something at this stage?
Well, I think Alison put it extremely well, didn't she? That there is a mixed bag, but definitely, I think the YouGov report is quite convincing that some older people, at least, are having poor mental health as effective lockdown. Interesting. We show within the Twins UK data, which I also work on, that younger people have been more affected mental health wise by the pandemic, and I think that may be iterated in some places, in other places. But it seems to affect rural and urban people differently. So younger people in rural areas are particularly affected, whereas older people in urban areas are particularly affected. And I think that's, if that's played out in other studies, that's has quite important policy implications. That the services and the facilities we put in place need to reflect maybe differences in rural and urban areas.
Just to mother question, are we too soft on older people?
I think we have in the past, when we've thought about physical activity and reducing sedentary behaviour, certainly when we've been thinking about social care support, we have been thinking that we need to make sure that our clients are encouraged to get up and make their own cups of tea and things, that, we don't sort of allow people to be too passive and do everything for them. That is certainly true. And I think, again, a lot of the guidelines and the narrative, the language around COVID has been that older people are very vulnerable. And, at one point we were threatening to sort of keep everybody over 70 indoors indefinitely and let everybody else go back to their normal lives. And I think, the power and importance of this report is to say that not everybody is the same, not everybody age 70 and over is at the same risk, and there are things that everybody can do to mitigate and reduce their risks, and physical activity is one of those. So I think if we have been too indulgent in the past, now is the time to stop that and to make sure people do as much as they can.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul, is there something you'd like to add before we go on to the next question?
Just to say that I think, the UK population as a whole is inactive, not just the older members of the population. The issue in relation to COVID is that, you know, that the older people have less resilience, so they are at greater risk from the inactivity. That's why I think it's more important to focus on the older people.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, Stephen, I think he's back from the briefing. Our next question, Stephen, is from Philip Greenish, but if you'd like to take over during his question, please do. I might just say to all three of our speakers that when we reach the end, we thought we'd give you all 1 minute to make a few key points, whatever you want to do in 60 seconds, before we thank you and move on to the conclusion of the meeting. So first of all, can I ask Philip to put your point, and Stephen Metcalfe will chair again from now on.
Yeah, this is just, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I'm not a great runner. I don't really like walking too far for the sake of walking, but I do enjoy playing quite a lot of tennis, and I enjoy my golf. So what do you all think about the prohibition on tennis and golf in this current lockdown in England?
Well, Stephen, your microphone is muted. If you wanted to take the...
Yeah, I'm happy to take over from here. The problem is that because I left the meeting and come back in, all my chat and Q&A has been cleared. So I have no idea who is indicating to ask a question. But Philip, you make an excellent point, and it's a point I put to the Prime Minister on last Monday about socially distanced sport and the risks. So I'd be very interested to hear some expert views on that. Would anyone like to say whether they think there's any logic in that current rule?
I'll be brave and
sure.
When the first lockdown came in, I was extremely glad to see the ability to go out and exercise being something that was preserved for everybody. And I think that exercise comes in many ways. You know, many people don't like running, and any kind of an outdoor activity is, we know, of much less risk than indoor activity. So I would say that I would certainly, speaking personally, would welcome the ability for people to do exercise outdoors in a variety of different ways, including, you know, going on the golf pitch. I don't really see the difference between going on the golf pitch and going to the local park and walking or running around that.
Yes, it's hard to fathom. Anyone want to add anything to that?
No, I share that view. I haven't been sort of privy to any of the conversations that have gone on where those rules were decided. But I mean, you know, the fitness and active leisure sector is on its knees, and there are people who want to be active, and they have made every attempt, the sector has made every attempt to make it safe, particularly outside. So I think it is something that should be revisited.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps someone in the team will pick up on that, and we could send something in my name to the Prime Minister, asking him to review his answer to my question last week, which was basically no. Right, I think next we have Eric Alborn. Eric, are you there? Please unmute yourself.
Hi. Firstly, I do welcome this Physiological Society report. I've not heard of it before, and I think it's very important. And thanks for your presentations. Just a couple of questions. To start with, somebody talked about physiological age and never referred to it again in any of the graphs or whatever. Is it a useful concept? Could you say something about it? More important, we're talking about exercises, and Claire was talking about regime she would like to have for older people, sort of online or whatever. Are there any recommended programs which you have assessed currently online which people can actually use? I'm 80 actually, so I'm quite interested to know about these things. Also, I wanted to just ask a little bit about the black box, which people are talking about long COVID, but may not be time for that. I'd like to know what's going on in research in that area. And my questions, 3.
Thanks, Eric. Who would like to try and tackle those?
I can talk about the first one, physiological aging. So, yeah, I think I used that term, and I apologize if I didn't refer to it again. It's very difficult to get everything in 12 minutes. But basically, you know, we have a concept where age-related decline, so, you know, loss of muscle mass, development of inability to regulate glucose. Many people think of these things as, you know, a facet of age. You often hear people say, you know, this is my age, when in reality, it's much more complex than that. There probably is an age-related component, but there's a huge lifestyle component. So, you know, if you put a young person in bed for several days, you can actually make them physiologically look very like an older person, despite, you know, chronological age changing by 1 week. So physiological aging probably is a good term. You know, Steve Harridge did some excellent work where he looked at these elite cyclists who've, you know, done over 120 kilometers, I think, a week for most of their, all of their adult life. And what you see there is, you know, some facets clearly are affected by or associated with physical activity levels. Some are less related. So I think, if I remember Steve's paper correctly, you know, maximal oxygen uptake, which is one of the measures I showed in my talk, which is basically the ability to utilize oxygen, that seemed to be less affected by physiological age and be more affected by chronological age.
My question really was, can you actually give, looking at some facet, some parameters of a person, do you sort of technically give people a physiological age, or is it just a vague concept?
In Steve's paper, he actually does that. He gives a physiological age of the elite cyclists who were, you know, over 65, all of them, I think. So yes, it is possible.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up on any of the points. If not, we will go to our next questioner, which is Neil Gaspar. Neil. And then I'll be going to Isabel Pollock-Huff.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can, yep.
Excellent. Neil Gaspar, AWE, a defence contractor. So my question is, if elderly person has been enforced inactivity for 2 weeks or whatever, can they recover muscle mass and these other measures of physiological ability?
Paul.
I would say it depends where they start from. So if you have an elderly older person and you do supervised exercise, then yes, you can recover it. I think for a frail person, it's a lot harder, probably because they will be unable to do the intensity of exercise necessary to get complete recovery.
Okay, thank you. Claire, you trying to?
Yeah, no, perhaps if I could come in there. While it's true that maybe a frailer older person can't necessarily do very high levels of activity, it is definitely true that physiotherapy programs after an illness in hospital, has been, 6-week programs are generally used throughout the UK and are very efficacious to get people back to physical functioning and back to baseline, and are really important and potentially more important in that group which is nearer their physiological reserve, because of course there's more to gain to be able to keep them independent. And so certainly physiotherapy and rehabilitation programs, even in frail older people, are efficacious and should be supported.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Lovely. Right, let's move on to our next questioner, which is Isabel.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you very much. My question is actually about sort of healthy eating, which we all hope to do. But I wonder if you have any comments on the benefits of any specific minerals, vitamins, supplements for this current scenario. Is there something that we could additionally do to help?
Who would like to comment on that?
Well, I will certainly come in. There's lots of interest, isn't there, from all of us about whether or not certain vitamins or supplements could be helpful in protection against coronavirus. And what I would say is this, is that we really need randomized controlled trials or proper trial evidence to really show for definite that any effects that are seen in observational studies are really true. We've come here many times before with vitamins and supplements that there is an observed correlation between taking a vitamin and having a better outcome. But that sometimes is, when a trial is done, found to be due to confounding by healthy behaviours that are otherwise held by that individual. And that's particularly an issue potentially with coronavirus, where people who take vitamins and supplements may well do other healthy behaviours, like, for example, wear masks and socially distance. So I think there's definite key interest. There's definite observational evidence that, for example, vitamin D in particular appears to be protective in observational studies, but we really do need those urgent trials to see whether they can be of benefit.
Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. I think Dawn Skelton would like to make a comment or two. Dawn? Dawn, I think you're still muted. Ah, that's better, right? Fire away.
Ah, well done, thank you. Somebody just asked about good online offers. There's an awful lot online. If you just type into YouTube older adults, you'll be, there's thousands. Sadly, everybody's a bit jumped on the bandwagon, and many of them are not appropriate. So they don't have a slow warm up. They take people straight into high intensity interval training. So the chance of adverse events is rather high. But there are essentially, my point in the chat box is, it doesn't take much to send an email or put a comment on the thing and ask what the person's qualifications are. And it's really important. It's fine for general older adult that just wants to get a bit fitter, but if you've got frailty in there, there should be qualified instructors working with them. So essentially they should be looking for a level 4 postural stability instructor, a level 3 exercise referral, or someone that's done older adults qualification. And it's very simple to ask that. And so I guess a little bit of education for seniors as to what to ask, what questions to ask. And so, for example, there'll be a lot of undiagnosed osteoporosis in this population. And so we don't want high impact straight away. They need to be built up to it slowly. So I guess, sadly, there is an awful lot on there online which isn't good. And ideally, it would be good to have some simple questions that older adults or their families could ask of the instructors, which would then put their mind at rest as to whether that was a good programme.
Dawn, that's a very good point. I don't know if anyone else just agree with it, I suppose. Yes, nodding. Right, I think we have no more questions that have come through. So perhaps I could give each of you an opportunity for 60 seconds or so to just sum up your key takeaways and what you would like us to summarize your presentation and the what you've heard this evening. I don't know who would like to start. Alison?
Okay, well, I think I would bite your hand off, Stephen, at your offer to make a representation to government, and in that I also include the advisors like the Chief Medical Officer, to just really reiterate what is in the report and what we see as really important efforts to support older adults to remain active, to reinstate activity if they've become less active, and to give people hope that there is something that they can do to mitigate the risks of the infection. So I think the wearing a mask, keeping your distance, washing your hands are really important and remain so. But I think now that we know so much more, we really need to encourage people to be active.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. Claire, would you like to go next?
Yes, certainly. So we know very well that older people have greater risk from acute coronavirus, and also it appears from long COVID. But what is less known is that really fit older adults actually do quite well and recover from COVID. So again, this reiterates the fact that A, older people are heterogeneous, so there's much diversity in older people, but B, the fitter they are, the more resilient they are, which really underpins this message that the more we can keep older people active and keeping active, the better older people will do from the long-term impact of COVID.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Paul, last word to you.
I think it would be good if we can promote the idea, you know, that being inactive is a physiological stress. It causes negative effects. You know, we hear about exercise and, you know, people exercising, being more active, but this is only going to be, you know, at most a few hours a day. The rest of the time, if you're sitting or lying down, that is going to cause a negative effect. And what we do know is it's very rapid. So, you know, within 3 days, you can see a fall in muscle protein synthesis, and you can see development of insulin resistance, both of which are very negative things in terms of aging physiology. So let's think about the negative effects of not moving rather than getting up and having to exercise. Move more.
Excellent. Paul, thank you very much indeed. Can I therefore draw this to a close and thank our speakers for their presentations, to David, to Alison, to Claire, and of course to Paul, right back at the beginning, for your support of this event. And of course, can I also mention Andrew Mackenzie and Tom Addison of the Physiological Society for their support in pulling this all together. I think it's been a very interesting presentation, or range of presentations. I'm sorry I missed out on some of it, but from what I picked up, it really has been very, very interesting. Can I therefore, again, thank our panelists, but also to my team at the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee, to Lee Jeffs, to Karen Smith, and Ben Allen for organising the event, and to Charlotte Hall, who is making notes furiously, I'm sure, somewhere, who will be writing this up for us. And it will be published in due course in our quarterly Science in Parliament magazine. Our next meeting will be on Monday, the 23rd of November. That's a morning meeting at 11 AM, when the theme will be global perspectives, how the UK and international researchers are working together to tackle COVID-19 across developing countries. And I'm very grateful to UKRI, who are helping us to put that together and are partnering with us for that discussion. So I very much hope that you will be able to join us. Until then, thank you for your attendance. Thanks again to everyone who's made a contribution, and we will see you all in the very near future. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.